Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us in this exciting lecture about cinematic philosophy. And in this first lecture, we will speak about why philosophy has always needed cinema. It's one of the most interesting and intriguing and exciting subjects to me. I've been working on this project for a very, very long time. It is part of my research book that I published with Palgrave Macmillan based on my Ph.D. dissertation from 2016. Essentially, it discusses on how film can create philosophical wisdom, how cinema can become a new platform for philosophical thought. This is extremely important to our time and place, especially because we are transitioning from a written-based society to a visual-based society, and it is important for us to master and understand how we can understand the visual medium in the best way possible to create hopefully thought-provoking ideas that would enlighten and educate and bring people better understanding of the world and help us confront the chaos that we all are in. First and foremost, the goal of the cinematic philosophy book, essentially what set up to do, is to help establish cinema as a new platform for philosophical thinking. If we think about the classical platforms that philosophy has been created, it was mostly created in the written, like articles and books, and also in the orals, lectures and discussions and dialogues, etc., etc. But it is not easily or naturally accepted that film or cinema can create philosophical wisdom. And then the other aspect of the goal of the cinematic philosophy book is to explore what can cinema or film give philosophy that the other platforms, in particular written and oral, cannot give it. So what can film and cinema give philosophy that other platforms could not have given them in the past? And that will probably lead to, if that is possible and if that is proven, it will lead not to only creating new types of ideas and possibilities, but also creating new types of thoughts, because at the end of the day, philosophy is the exploration and analysis of ideas and thoughts, and we'll get into that in a second. Let's just jump into the key terms in this lecture. First of all, what is cinematic? Cinematic is essentially the way we use it in this lecture and in the book as well, is an umbrella term. It includes movies and online videos and TV and mobiles and TikToks and 20 seconds elements like that. Obviously, coming from media studies and having a background in media studies, I understand the importance of identifying the difference between the different mediums. There's a huge difference between the medium, of course, is the message. There's a huge difference between movies and mobile phones and TV and streaming and short content and long content, etc., etc. But for this specific lecture, we will just put cinematic under the one umbrella term. And essentially, the idea of calling it cinematic comes from the Greek word kinema. Kinema in Greek means movement. And it is essentially, the way I define it, is a story or an idea or an emotion that is expressed or told through movement or motion. So it's not really just or merely just a visual possibility, because a visual possibility could also be a painting on the wall or a photograph, which is a still image. It is not merely a narrative possibility, because a narrative possibility might be something that one reads in a book, and it is imagined in their mind, rather than being seen or observed on a screen with movement and sounds and colors and editing, etc., etc. Cinema, however, incorporates all of these, like images and sounds and story and colors and music, etc., etc., into an idea or an emotion that is told through movement. And that's why I believe that articulating it as cinematic is the best way to go. On the other hand, let's jump into some key terms of philosophy. Now, obviously, I'm not going to speak about what is philosophy. It's a question that has been asked for centuries, and still there's a lot of arguments. But essentially, the way it is identified within the research of cinematic philosophy is the history and analysis of ideas. if we think about it, everything surrounding us is ideas. Politics, the way we govern our world, why do we give somebody the power to make the decisions to do that? Ethics and morals, why do we think that that is good and that is bad? Why do we think that this behavior should take somebody to prison and that behavior should give them a prize? All sorts of ideas about how our economical cake is being divided, whether it's socialism or capitalism or feudalism, and as well as science. All of these big subjects are ideas. Philosophy is the exploration of ideas. So essentially, it is exploring the world from the most essential tool that we have, which is our own mind. And the tools of our mind is deduction, logic, analysis, criticism, etc., etc. There are a variety of disciplines within philosophy, such as ethics, epistemology, ontology, aesthetics, logics, and metaphysics, and a few other ones as well. But that is essentially what philosophy is. Essentially, is the exploration of ideas, exploration and analysis of ideas. Different methods for philosophy. Okay, of course, there's lots of arguments on what counts as a philosophical work and what doesn't count as a philosophical work. Just one example is obviously the argument between analytical philosophy and continental philosophy. Analytical philosophers sometimes look at continental philosophers and do not define them as philosophers. Of course, one famous example is Nietzsche, that was against any type of method of structure, logic, or coherences, or building of arguments with that. There's also, I think, one of the main elements is the Socratic tradition, is to essentially make people question their basic assumption. And I think that is one of the strongest elements that we have with philosophy, and one of the guiding elements that in film and philosophy, at least in this book, or cinematic philosophy, this is what has led the argument in deep ways. Now we're jumping into the heart of the research. So philosophy up until now has been focused on two main platforms. First of all, oral philosophy, which is lectures and dialogues. And the second is written philosophy, books and articles. And our goal in the cinematic philosophy book and research is to show that our time, our era, introduces a new possibility for philosophy, that is cinematic philosophy. If cinema can become a new platform for philosophy, then we have to understand the relationship between film and philosophy. And on top of that, there has to be a firm connection between the two disciplines. Philosophy and cinema should be equally valued. If cinema, for example, is viewed as a degraded medium for philosophy, then the arguments and the discipline of film and philosophy or cinematic philosophy will always be degraded to a small niche or a side discipline within academic departments of philosophy. So breaking the code to the relationship between film and philosophy, in my mind, is one of the most important elements that we can do to this field. Traditional philosophy, traditional film and philosophy, this is when I was an undergrad and also a master. I remember getting very excited about the articles and books and analysis about finding philosophical evidence within films, such as films as The Matrix or Groundhog's Day. There's lots of other examples. But the traditional methodology of film and philosophy is essentially finding philosophical evidence within films, which is essentially watching a film, for example, Matrix, and finding philosophical evidence for that, maybe connecting it to Baudrillard. You can connect him to Berkeley theory, you can connect him to Marx as well. There's many layers for that film that can be connected to some sort of a philosophical theory or a specific philosophy. However, I think that is what is considered to be the traditional methodology for film and philosophy, or which is essentially finding philosophical evidence within films or within certain films. I argue that as much as this endeavor is important, it has yet to and will probably never establish cinema as a medium that can create philosophy. Now, is it very important to do this analysis and to find philosophical evidence within films? Yes, but will it prove that film can create philosophy? I don't think so. And one example is like, how many analyses of philosophy within films would it take to prove that the actual medium can create or has the potential to create philosophy? Does it take like 500, 50,000 analyses of films that have philosophical ideas within them that would prove that the film can create philosophy? And what about a bad analysis, or an analysis that is not as sufficient as other analysis? Would that take down the entire discipline for that? There are more reasons that I elaborate in the book, but I believe that this method, and it is a very important method, and I also do it myself, is yet to and will probably never establish cinema or film as a platform to create philosophy, or at least as a platform that has the potential to create philosophical thinking. So I believe that in order to begin answering or showing the potential that film can create philosophy, we have to ask a different type of question. And that question in my mind is why philosophy has always needed cinema. This is a completely different methodology. I remember that when I was doing my Ph.D. dissertation, and I told people that I was like doing, my dissertation was on films and philosophy and how film can become a new platform to create philosophical ideas. A lot of like my friends and colleagues ask me, oh, what films are you using? That is not the methodology I use. I find it to be very, very important, but I take a completely different route in terms of like trying to show how film can become, how film can create philosophical ideas. And the answer to that must come from exploring philosophy itself and the discipline of philosophy or the history of philosophy, and hopefully finding cinematic evidence within the history of philosophy. Now, obviously, this is a strange question since cinema is 120 years old. It was created in, or the technical possibility to manifest it was in 1895, and philosophy is much, much older. I believe that in order to begin answering why philosophy has always needed cinema, we have to go into the subject of thought experiments. Thought experiments are illustrations, short narratives that help us understand a theory. Their main goal is to take an abstract or complicated idea or concept and simplify it. Thought experiments have been very, very important throughout the history of philosophy, as well as other disciplines as well, such as science and economics, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into that. And they have been used historically since the pre-Socratic era until quantum mechanics and until today in many, many different disciplines and realms. And usually thought experiments is being used when a real-world experiment is impossible to create. In the majority of times, a thought experiment will be communicated through a diagram or through a short narrative, a short type of story. Now, the connection between thought experiments and films or cinema has been dealt with in the discipline of film and philosophy substantially. Especially since 2000s, there are many, many researchers that have found the connection between thought experiments and certain films. In my mind, the most comprehensive and the one that inspired me the most is Thomas Wattenberg's book that he wrote in 2007, Thinking Screen. I actually highly recommend this book if you are interested in the subject. It is, I believe that within that book, Wattenberg establishes a link between thought experiments and films. I'm not going to go too much and too deep into Wattenberg's theories, but I'll just kind of like skim through it very, very quickly. I do, however, recommend that if you are interested in the discipline, certainly go and read Wattenberg's book. In his book, Wattenberg shows how specific philosophical techniques, such as thought experiments, can be used in specific films. And if film can screen thought experiments, then cinema can screen philosophy or serve as an illustration to philosophy. Now, Wattenberg defines that illustrations are not philosophical works, but illustrations are very important. So thought experiments are very important to philosophy, although they are not the build-up of the argument. They're just like on the side illustrations or short stories or short narratives that help explain the theory, but at the same time, they are very, very important. And that's how film and cinema can create philosophical works. And this is essentially how he finds the link. This is Wattenberg and me a few years ago, and it's actually really also not only great researchers and a brilliant mind, but also an extremely nice human being. Wattenberg, I believe, and I argue that Wattenberg establishes a link between film and philosophy. And being inspired by Wattenberg's ideas, I believe that there's a huge potential. But I suggest a different perspective to Wattenberg, humbly suggest a different perspective to Wattenberg. What I suggest is to turn the exploration on its head. It's not merely that certain films can embody or be considered to be thought experiments. It is actually the other way around. What I argue is that the entire phenomena of thought experiments within the history of philosophy points to a cinematic need, to a cinematic type of thinking need at the heart of philosophy. So this is a completely different perspective on thought experiments. This offers a different perspective on the link between films and philosophy, or film and philosophy. In order to establish the relation between film and philosophy, it's not searching for philosophical evidence within films, but instead searching for cinematic evidence within philosophy, or at least the history of philosophy. And let's just jump into an example. An example is always the best way to go. Let's take an example from one of the most famous philosophical notions and questions in the history of philosophy, Plato's allegory of the cave in the Republic. I argue that the interesting question about Plato's allegory of the cave is not necessarily the comparison to the first spectators of cinema and how they are chained onto the cave and are mesmerized by the moving images and sound. There's also many analyses on how essentially we are all in the cave of the mind, and we are unable to see reality, and we always are being mesmerized by the shadows on the wall. These are all very interesting theories, but it's not what I am focusing or interested in this case. I argue that the interesting question about Plato's allegory of the cave is, why does Plato needs to use such a visual, narrative, theatrical, and cinematic allegory in order to explain his metaphysics? Why would Plato, which is one of the biggest opposers to art's potential to express any sort of truth, will use such a visual, narrative, and cinematic allegory and tale with an artistic flavor to it? I argue that in order to better explain and understand his metaphysics and philosophy, Plato needs to think cinematically, 2,000 years before the creation and the birth of cinema. But it's not just Plato, and this is not an isolated event. One just needs to look at the list of philosophers, as well as scientists, who have employed these fictional, narrative, cinematic tales within their theories, what we call thought experiment, to realize that this is not an isolated event. It is a pattern, and it is a pattern of thinking cinematically within the history of philosophy. Let's go to another famous example by Titus Lucretius. In order to show that space is infinite, Lucretius gives us an example of a spear. Let's imagine a spear, and let's throw the spear to the edge of the universe. Let's say this is the edge of the universe, and let's say this is the spear. This is obviously an envelope opener. But this is the edge of the universe, and this is the spear. If I throw the spear and I go through, it means that there's something beyond the edge of the universe. If I throw the spear and the spear hits back and bounces back from the edge of the universe, it means that there is something beyond the edge of the universe. Hence, in both cases, we cannot get into the edge of the universe, hence the universe is infinite. This is a short and visual allegory to show a very complex concept of how space is infinite, and is used in a very interesting and easy to grasp visual example. Okay, so let's take an example now from science, from Isaac Newton and a famous thought experiment, the cannonball thought experiment. What would Isaac Newton and cannonballs have together? So, in order to explain the orbit of the moon, Newton gives us an example with cannonball. So let's imagine, let's say this is the globe, this is Earth, and let's say that you have, let's say you go to a top of a mountain. On the top of the mountain, you put a very powerful and strong cannonball. That cannonball is being fired at the same rate that the Earth curves away from it. And then as long as, let's say this is the top of the mountain, boom, it's been fired. And as long as it continues to fall at the same rate with nothing to interfere it and with nothing to stop it, it will continue in that orbit until it reaches the same spot that it began, the same top of the mountain. And if it will not interfere over there, it will continue its orbit indefinitely unless it's being interfered by all sorts of like different elements and things. So this is essentially the cannonball thought experiment by Isaac Newton. We could arrive at the same conclusion through calculations and other elements, but this very, very short allegory or short narrative or short visual example gives us that elusive understanding that is so hard to get sometimes. All right, so I should put this aside. So the Earth just went out of orbit. All good. So when we look at like the history of thought experiments, we actually identify a pattern. And one of the big questions is, why would any philosopher want to use these visual elements in order to explain some of their most complicated ideas? Why would Descartes use the evil genius thought experiment to help explain some of his theories at in the meditations? Why would David Hume explain the induction problem through the sun or through the returning sun? Why would Erwin Schrödinger challenge quantum mechanics through cats, live or dead? Why would any philosopher use a visual narrative and I would say a cinematic technique with an artistic flavor to it in their theories, or to help explain some of their most complicated theories and concepts that they dealt with? If you look at the history of philosophy, and if you look at the list of philosophers that have been using it in the history of philosophy, you can identify a pattern. It's a pattern of thinking visually, cinematically, within the history of philosophy. This is a very, very partial list, but it essentially ranges from the pre-Socratics of Lucretius, Descartes, Galileo, Hume, Berkeley, Leibniz, Ernst Mach, Pascal, Newton, Russell, Schrödinger, Wittgenstein, Albert Einstein, Hilary Putnam, John Rawls, and many, many more who have employed thought experiments, this visual, narrative, and cinematic technique that we know as thought experiments within their theories. When we look at like the history of thought experiments within philosophy, we can identify a pattern. It's a pattern of thinking visually, theatrically, cinematically within philosophy. It means essentially that all these philosophers, in order to confront some of their most complicated ideas, needed to think in a visual or cinematic way to help explain some of their most challenging and complex theories. So now, after we have established the first phase of our argument, we move to the second level, or the second phase of our argument. And the question is, are thought experiments cinematic? Do thought experiments, that's the question, signify a cinematic need within the history of philosophy that has been identified through the pattern that we have mentioned earlier? And this goes back into what we defined at the beginning of what is cinematic. Cinema, originating from the Greek word kinema, means movement. It is not merely a visual possibility, because visual could be a still image, and lots of these thought experiments have a story within them, a narrative, a certain type of movement that is there. And it's also not merely a narrative possibility, because a narrative possibility can be something that one imagines when reading a book. However, cinema incorporates both the visuals and the images, sounds and colors, etc., but also a story or an idea that are expressed through movement. This is why I think what thought experiments signify, the need that they signify, is best articulated by calling it cinematic. I'm not going to be arguing against like calling them visual or narrative, but I think what best describes them is calling them cinematic. Essentially, cinema comes from the Greek word kinema, telling a story or an idea or an emotion through movement. So telling stories through movement, and that also incorporates the visual element, which could also be a still image or photograph, and also a narrative element, which could be a story, an idea that one imagines when reading a book, but not seeing it on a specific screen. Essentially, if we also go back into Thomas Wattenberg's perception and his great work about connecting and linking the relationship between film and philosophy through thought experiments, if in Wattenberg's analysis, certain films, and this is what he established in his books and in his writings, if certain films can be considered thought experiments, the other side of the equation, if we turn Wattenberg's argument on their head, or looking at them from a different perspective, certain thought experiments can be considered somewhat cinematic. So this is the moment that we go beyond thought experiments, because the question that we ask in our research is not really targeted on thought experiments themselves. Thought experiments is a name of a structured technique within the history of philosophy. What I argue is that thought experiments signify a need for a cinematic type of thinking at the heart of philosophy. So we are focusing on what is the need within philosophy that all these philosophers needed throughout the years of engaging with ideas, with these concepts, with these theories. What is the need that they signify beyond that? And what I argue is that thought experiments signify a need for a cinematic type of thinking. So at the heart of philosophy, at the heart of the history of philosophy, philosophers needed to think cinematically in order to understand some of the most complex theories, ideas, and concepts. But then, only in 1895, cinema was invented. And for centuries, all these philosophers needed to think and imagine cinematic type of thinking in order to solve some of the most challenging problems. But post-1895, we can do much more than merely imagine or think cinematically. We can actually do it and then later on see it on a screen. This is the moment where we actually separate from traditional thought experiments to cinematic thought experiments. So considering films as traditional thought experiments or illustrations or representations to a theory, I argue, leads to a limited perception of the potential of cinematic thought experiments. Cinematic thought experiments can no longer be considered as traditional thought experiments. And here is why. This is one of the definitions of what thought experiments are, and I'm taking this from Brown and Fine in 2010. Thought experiments are devices of the imagination that are used to investigate the nature of things. Thought experimenting often takes place when a method of variation is employed in entertaining imaginative suppositions. So even from just the beginning definition of what thought experiments are, we can see that they are devices of the mind, and they are essentially in the laboratory of the mind and confined to the laboratory of the mind. Cinematic thought experiments are very, very different from that. There are a few other questions and issues with traditional thought experiments and connecting them to cinematic thought experiments. One of the main issues with traditional thought experiments is how we can learn anything new about the world just by thinking itself without any use of empirical data. Now, without leaping into definition of what empirical data is, there is no doubt that cinema utilizes a certain type of empirical data, whether it is the recorded visuals or sound, and whether they are manipulated or not. There is no doubt that cinema incorporates a certain type of empirical data. This is why it's another reason why it's very hard to connect traditional thought experiments with cinematic thought experiments that we can see and experience on screen. But the biggest difference is that with traditional thought experiments, we imagine the thought experiment. Whether it is the story of the cave, we have to imagine the cave, and we have to imagine the fire, and the shadows on the wall, and the shackled prisoners. It is all imagined in our mind and in our brain. Now, there's nothing wrong with imagining, but it is a very different experience to seeing and experiencing on a certain screen. Now, the difference between imagining philosophy to seeing and experiencing philosophy is huge. And cinematic thought experiments, on the other hand, make us see and experience the thought experiment on a certain type of screen, whether it is the cinema theater or on TV or your mobile phone or iPads or whatever that might be. We don't have to imagine the thought experiments. We can see and experience the thought experiments. And the difference between imagining philosophy to seeing and experiencing philosophy holds a huge potential to the discipline of philosophy and must be further investigated. And this is always an example that I like to give. Here is the word apple, and I'll give each and one of us a few seconds to kind of like imagine whatever apple it comes to mind. That imagination or that type of like apple that appears in your mind right now depends on where you grew up, what type of apples you like, what colors do you like. This is my apple. But there's a huge difference between imagining the apple and seeing and experiencing on screen. Now, this is a very, very basic example of the potential, that points of the potential and the difference between imagining something to seeing it on the screen. But the potential to see and experience philosophy holds an unprecedented possibility for the discipline of philosophy. Okay, are we rolling? Okay, I did bring some coffee to wrap this episode down. So let's just do like a quick recap of what we have discussed in the first lecture of Cinematic Philosophy lecture series, in the episode of Why Philosophy Has Always Needed Cinema. So our explanation has led us to show that philosophy has always needed the visualization and cinematization of its ideas and theories. This is evident in the use of thought experiments. So the pattern of using thought experiments in the history of philosophy shows that all of these philosophers needed to think cinematically in order to understand some of the most complex theories. The concept, however, if we compare traditional thought experiments to cinematic thought experiments, it's a completely different entity, because the concept of like traditional thought experiments is confined to the laboratory of the mind. It is something that one imagines. And this is one of the reasons why thought experiments are always on the side and always illustrations, because they help explain a theory because there was no way to manifest it. But post 1895, there is a technical possibility to manifest a certain type of thinking that was always needed within the history of philosophy. And this offers a huge potential to the discipline of philosophy and also human thought, because thought experiments have always pointed to a cinematic type of thinking that was always needed within philosophy, but there was no way to manifest it beside a few small allegories, short stories, maybe a painting or some sort. But post 1895, we have the potential to manifest that type of thinking as an experience on screen. This holds a huge potential to the discipline of philosophy as well as to human thinking, and this is something that must be further investigated, and this is something we further investigate in the Cinematic Philosophy book, and also in the lecture series in the following episodes that we will create very soon. In the next episode, Cinesophia, an extremely exciting episode, we will focus on a few questions. One of the questions is, what can the cinematic platform give philosophy that the other platforms, written philosophy and oral philosophy, cannot? The other question that we will focus on, which is extremely exciting, is what is cinematic? This is a very important question. It draws a lot from film studies and filmmaking itself, where we analyze the different elements and layers and levels of creating films and engagement within the cinematic platform. And a little spoiler, we will argue that the cinematic platform has the potential to make us see and experience philosophy as an in-action event. Now the possibility to see and experience philosophy offers an unprecedented potential and possibility to philosophy and human thinking, and it's something that we are very excited about. Join us for our second episode. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.